Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, wherever you are in the world, and I do hope that you're incredibly well and that you've had a fabulous day. So before we get started with tonight's story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, my name is Susanna, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in 1962 when I was a young girl of only 14 years old at the time. I'd rather not tell you whereabouts in North America this all transpired for the purposes of remaining anonymous, because the nature of my story is very strange and bizarre and certainly does not conform to the conventional title of a traditional Bigfoot encounter by any manner of means. For this reason, keeping my details secret is a very good idea as far as I'm concerned, but it doesn't make my story any less true. And whether you believe it is spurious or not is entirely up to you. Let's face it, every Bigfoot encounter is fictitious, because eyewitness accounts are not considered reliable enough, which is why Bigfoot still remains a cryptid, mythical-type creature. This is, of course, until documented science can finally prove that Bigfoot is true. Until then, he still remains a fabricated creature of fiction. For those of us who have physically seen him, we know that he's real. But until you've actually seen him yourself, you'll always be left wondering, asking, and maybe even doubting, and who can blame you for that? I most certainly don't. I grew up in a delightful rural setting where all the houses on our street were set against magnificent blue-grey mountains, emerald green rolling hills, rugged ridges and rocky outcrops, as well as vast areas of natural green resplendent forest that literally swept back for hundreds upon hundreds of miles. The houses in our street were all ranch style and painted in bright, flashy, cheerful colours, from bright pinks to mauves, purples, peaches, oranges, yellows, blues and even greens. Not like today, where house colours are much more plain, minimalistic, subdued and understated. The houses in those days possessed their own unique, charming, individualistic terraced gardens that were perfectly manicured and offset by stunning, colourful flowers in spring, summer and autumn, sumptuously perfectly mown green lawns as well. I lived in the smallest house on our street with my mother, but my mother's sister, Aunt Selena, lived only a few houses down in the largest, glitziest house on the street that was painted in a dazzling bright purple colour and was stunningly beautiful. Neither my aunt or my mother had ever been married, so I was raised just by my mother, and I was told that she had no recollection of who my father actually was, and that was something that infuriated me a great deal growing up, as you can imagine. How I longed for a father, and I truly envied my friends who grew up with their mother and father in what I considered to be a stereotypical, normal, quintessential family home. When I expressed my misgivings and reservations about not having a normal family to my mother, she would always say, "What is normal? There is no such thing as normal. Every family has its idiosyncrasies. You mark my words, dear. On the outside, things may look normal, but on the inside, it's a very different story altogether. There is no such thing as normal. That idea is complete fallacy," she'd say. My mother worked as a nurse at the local hospital, where she engaged in night shift duties looking after the very sick people. It was on those nights that I was left to go and stay with my Aunt Selena, which was usually one night a week. Aunt Selena was a very peculiar, eccentric woman who was always attired in long, flowing, bright-coloured clothes and wore hundreds of bright beads on her neck. She had a long mane of grey hair, which she wore back in a very severe, tight bun, and she had very dark brown eyes and a long, pointed, beak-like nose. On the side of her cheek she had a pair of long cat's whiskers that grew out of a large black mole that I always secretly longed to pluck with a pair of sharp tweezers, but never actually had the courage to do so. I never enjoyed going to stay at Aunt Selena's because there was something about her that set my nerves on edge. In truth, she gave me the creeps, and in her presence I was never completely at ease. Another thing that bothered me was that there was a room in the corner of her kitchen that looked very much like a large pantry. It appeared to be bolted up with a double padlock and was out of bounds to everyone, and it seemed incredibly strange to me that she was hiding something. I was sure of that, and I would always wonder what it was that she was hiding. One day the answer was revealed to me, and imagine my shock and horror when I discovered my aunt's deep, dark secret that she had been hiding from us for so many long years. It all happened when I arrived at Aunt Selena's home a couple of hours too impetuously. I was going to be spending the night at her house on that evening, as my mother was on night shift. I entered my aunt's large, spacious kitchen and could see her through the large kitchen window, busying herself in the yard. She was wearing a wide-brimmed summer hat and a pair of green gardening gloves, and was bustling around with a trowel in her hand, busying herself with some compost in the vegetable patch, as she was planting seedlings like lettuce, carrots and tomatoes. I was just about to go and greet her and say hello, but she was seemingly so preoccupied and distracted by her digging, and I realised she hadn't actually noticed me standing there in her kitchen. I suddenly noticed that the bolted door of the secret room in the corner of her kitchen was lying half open, and the heavy padlock was lying on the kitchen table. My aunt had failed to lock it behind her, and I knew in that moment that this was my perfect opportunity to unravel the mystery, with titles such as sacrificial offerings to the gods and goddesses, hexes and curses, spells and rituals, occult secrets and mysteries, the Book of Shadows, and how to run your own witch's coven. I promise you, reading these strange esoteric titles on her books made my blood run cold. Growing up, I'd always believed that witches, warlocks and wizards were the stuff of children's fairy tales, but by the look of my aunt's secret room, I could tell that she was definitely involved in the occult and witchcraft of some kind. This revelation was disturbingly horrifying to me, as all my worst fears about my aunt's life were finally confirmed. There was a huge leather-bound black diary on a large desk, and it was marked Friday the 13th at 12 p.m. at the Pine Needles, offerings to gods and goddesses. Then there were the 5 names of women who I knew lived in our local town, all who were the oddbells and misfits of our local community, whom had possibly found my aunt's friendship a beguiling lure. Were they all secret members of this witches' coven, I wondered to myself in horror and amazement, all at the same time. I noticed a large book on my aunt's desk that was bookmarked, and I opened the page which read, Worshipping the Gods and Goddesses. It is good to show thanks and gratitude to the gods and goddesses with large bowls of fruit and nuts, bunches of flowers and black candles. This is beneficial to the coven, bringing bountiful blessings your way, for thankfulness brings its due rewards. I knew that the Pine Needles was one of the wooded areas on the left-hand side of the street, which was a favourite spot for many of the locals to frequent during the day, to take their dogs for walks, or to have a picnic by the stream that meandered through the pretty wooded area. It was also a wonderful retreat for the white-tailed deer, mule deer and elk to congregate for a refreshing, cool summer drink. Now I realised it was also a site for more nefarious activities that took place during the witching hours of the night, while the rest of the community slept. I looked around the room to see if there was anything else of interest, but apart from a box of black candles and some peculiar bottles of strange herbs, and a large black witch's cloak hanging on a hook on the inside door, there was literally nothing else of significant interest. So I quickly retreated from the room, leaving everything as I'd found it, and went out to greet my aunt. In the days that followed, I could not think of anything else but the insidious double life that Aunt Selena led. The thought of her operating as a witch in the dark hours of the night was not a pretty thought, and quite literally left me feeling very rattled and on edge. I did ask my mother some probing questions, like if she believed that there could be witches practicing their arts in the 1960s, and my mother laughed out loud and said, "Oh dear, you do have your head in the clouds sometimes. No, there is no such thing as witches and warlocks in our day and age," she assured me. What a very strange question to ask me. She continued, "In the olden days, people were falsely accused of witchcraft and hung at the stake, like the Salem witch trials of 1692, where 20 people were executed for being witches. But no, those things don't exist today. But they do play a crucial part in myths and legends and fairy tales, and of course riveting children's stories, not to mention Halloween and other kiddies' events." "Are you sure?" I asked. You don't think that Aunt Selena could surreptitiously be a witch? She has a huge hairy mole on her cheek, and a pointed nose, and very hawk-like eyes, and she's a very creepy woman." My mother hooted with laughter. "Selena, a witch," she joked. "Never in a million years, dear. Just because you think your aunt has a witch-like appearance does not make her a witch, any more than me doing a few pirouettes and a few pliés makes me a prima ballerina. No, she's definitely not a witch." "What if she's got some books on the occult and dark arts?" I suggested. "What then?" "Well, your aunt is a little eccentric, let's not kid," said my mother. "She's interested in unusual phenomena, but what's wrong with that? It does not surprise me if she's got some unusual books hanging around, but she certainly isn't a witch." Now, my suggestion to you, dear, is to stop filling your head with all these crazy ideas about your poor Aunt Selena. I'm sure she would be mortified to hear you talking about her in this light. I was not sure that my mother was actually right. I did not have the heart to mention to her the secret bolted room in my aunt's kitchen corner that was filled with all kinds of strange mystical books on witchcraft and spells. If there was really nothing to the story, why was my aunt hiding these things behind bolted doors, I wondered. Had not my mother always taught me, growing up, that you have nothing to hide if you have nothing to hide? It was then that I came to the decision that on Friday the 13th, I would be going to the Pine Needle Woods myself to see what was going on with my Aunt Selena. I needed to find answers to my questions. I would hide behind a tree and see what happened, I thought. Then I would be able to decide for myself whether Aunt Selena was actually a witch or not, and whether she was a leader of a witch's coven, or whether she was just simply a crazy, loopy woman with bizarre and fanciful ideas about becoming a witch. And so it was. I was awoken to the sound of my alarm at 11 p.m. on Friday the 13th. I groaned as I got up out of bed, wondering if this plan of mine was a good idea after all. I hoped that the buzzing sound of my alarm clock hadn't woken my mother, but she did remain fast asleep. I could hear her quiet snores down the passageway. I quickly dressed, put on some clothes and a pair of sneakers, and gathered a flashlight, and off I trotted to the pine woods to take care to be as quiet as possible so as not to awaken the entire neighbourhood. As strange as this sound, I actually felt a flurry of excitement, because in my heart I really sensed something extraordinary was about to happen. Little did I know that the extraordinary things that were about to unfold this night would have me asking questions for many years to come, until one day, out of the blue, the answer would come to me like the light suddenly shining in a dark room, divulging every single secret. I have never been to the Pine Needle Woods late at night before, but it was intriguing to be out this late. It was a dusky night with the pearly light of a glistening half-moon and a scattering of pretty stars that glistened like pretty jewelled diamonds in the vast firmament. It really was a magnificent night, I thought to myself. As I entered the woods, I could smell the evocative aroma of pine needles under my feet and the strong, intoxicating smell of jasmine. I was surprised how incredibly quiet it was, which did leave me with an uneasy feeling. I could not hear the usual sounds of frogs croaking and the chorus of the crickets and the hoots of the owls, sounds that I was well acquainted with living in the country, so I did find the absence of these sounds decidedly odd and very disconcerting. I was not sure which was the best place for me to hide, but I assumed that if there was going to be some kind of a witch's ritual, it would need to be done in the larger clearing in the middle of the woods that was close to the proximity to the gushing stream. I found myself the perfect spot behind a large towering oak tree, and then I watched, counting the minutes by every second with my watch. It was 2 minutes to 12 when I suddenly heard the sounds of esoteric chanting and humming, and then I saw them. There were 6 shadowy dark forms, all wearing long black cloaks with hoods that covered their heads. In the darkness of the night, they did look ominously menacing and satanic, as their dark robes flowed in the gentle breeze. They were all carrying lanterns in their hands that succeeded in brightening up the whole clearing in a gentle light, Then I saw one of the figures pull back the hood of her cloak, and I could see that it was Aunt Selena. She instructed everybody to sit in a circle, and then with a match she proceeded to light up hundreds of black candles that were propped up in candle holders that were scattered over the entire clearing. I assumed she must have placed them there earlier in the day in anticipation of her ritual. Suddenly the whole clearing was illuminated by this soft, gentle, flickering light of her pretty candles. Once again the chanting continued, and then my aunt raised her arms above her head and started speaking in some strange Latin-sounding language that I could not comprehend, and then suddenly she started to speak English. "Gods and goddesses," she said, "we humble ourselves before you on this night. We bring you our sacrificial gifts to honour you and give you thanks for the changing of the seasons, for the rising of the sun and for the setting of the moon. We give you thanks for the waters from the heavens and the warmth of the sun that brings us food to our tables and strength and nourishment to our bodies." Aunt Selena then went over to the large oversized suitcase that she had clearly brought into the woods earlier in the day and proceeded to unlock it. She then took out the most enormous bowls of fruit, nuts and flowers, and every one of the hooded figures came to retrieve their own individual gifts, and they were to present to the gods and goddesses. Finally they pulled back their hoods to reveal their faces, and I recognized the ladies as the oddballs of our local community. I watched in stunned amazement as they kneeled down and then kissed the earth with their lips and presented their gifts at the base of a very large oak tree while they continued to chant. Then my aunt got out 7 silver goblets and raised up a bottle of wine to the heavens. "We drink the blood of the grape, the fruit of the vine, to honour all the gods and goddesses. To honour the gods and goddesses," they all chorused. "To honour the gods and goddesses." They started to toast and raise glasses, and their lips became stained by the deep red wine which they drained in their mouths until their goblets were dry. My aunt, then picking up a loose tree branch, proceeded to bang the side of a large oak tree 3 times, hitting it very hard so that it made a loud banging sound. "We honour you," she said, and all the women chanted after her, "We honour you, we honour you." My aunt then banged the side of the tree 3 more times. "We honour you, gods and goddesses." Once again all 5 women chanted, "We." Towered at about 10 feet off the ground, but it was his girth that impressed me the most, because he was about 5 feet wide, was thick, brawny and muscular. His whole body from head to toe was covered in waves of thick, long, lustrous black hair, and his arms were so long they could almost touch his ankles without bending over. I was amazed to observe that the shoulders on this creature were humongous, as they supported a very large cone-shaped head. I was fascinated to see that his long face seemed to possess a combination of human and ape-like influences, with a very deep-set pair of treacle-brown eyes and a very prominent brow ridge, slender mouth and flat nose. I was fortunate to see the detail of this creature so clearly under the light of the lanterns and the enchanting candlelight. I truly should have been trembling in my boots in an act of unadulterated terror, as most people invariably would have been. However, I was so astounded and I gasped by what I was actually seeing, and so impressed by the creature's magnificence, that for a while it would seem that my terror and fear were momentarily suppressed by my complete awe and approbation for this remarkable, awesome creature. Yet I assure you, I was in absolutely no doubt that this creature was highly dangerous and exceedingly formidable, and like any apex predator, demanded respect, and to fear him would be the wisest course of action you could make. The creature seemed surprised to see all 6 of these cloaked women bowing down before him, believing him to be some kind of a god who had responded to their offerings. I believe for this hairy humanoid, seeing these women like this in such a passive, submissive role, made him feel quite smugly satisfied, and also pleased that he wasn't actually being challenged. He proceeded to make a few grunting sounds, and then he started pounding his chest as if to say, "I'm glad you acknowledge my superiority and magnificence over you." Truly, he seemed so pleased by the bended knees and the lowered heads. Suddenly he perceived all the offerings lying at the base of the oak tree. He took the flowers and disposed of them across the forest floor with incredibly little interest in them, as if their delicate beauty had all but escaped him. When he saw the huge bowls of fruit and nuts, he allowed the huge, powerful, testosterone-driven male bravado to slip away, and he quite suddenly became like a naughty, mischievous monkey who could not wait to dive into the goodies. Even I was smiling as I saw this complete transformation in the creature's personality that quite literally went from dominance to childlike whimsical exuberance in a matter of seconds. Judging by the sheer delight on his face, you would have thought all his Christmases had come at once. He quite literally looked thrilled and ecstatic, and eagerly popped a couple of juicy strawberries into his mouth, making an appreciative oohing and ahhing sound as he proceeded to carry the large bowls of fruit away. I watched in stupefied awe as he glided back into the woods on his long, agile legs, and then I could hear him whistling all the way. He was one big, happy bundle of hair. That's all I can say. Once the creature had actually gone, all 6 women were weeping, including my aunt. I realised suddenly that they were crying tears of joy. "The gods answered us!" cried my Aunt Selena in delight. "The gods answered us! Isn't this the most wonderful thing that has ever happened to you? The gods took on human form and came to get our gifts. Do you realise what an honour this is for us?" she declared in ecstatic enthusiasm. One of the ladies was quick to point out that the gods had not been very interested in the flowers, but had shown a great deal of enthusiasm and eagerness for the fruit and the nuts. "I think the gods are not at all pleased with our flowers," she said, pointing to the flower heads whose petals were sprinkled over the forest floor in clouds of confetti. Fast forward a few weeks, and I told my mother about our nightly adventure in the woods. I revealed to her how Aunt Selena and her so-called coven of witches had bowed down before this hairy humanoid ape, believing him to be some kind of a god. They had not realised that they were bowing down to this massive black bipedal ape, who was anything but a god, and had only appeared as a response to some wood-knocking that Aunt Selena had performed as part of her dubious ritual. "Mum, he was titanic in size," I told her, "and unlike anything I've ever seen in my entire life, because, believe me, he was flesh and blood, and was definitely not supernatural." "How extraordinary," said my mother. "I wonder what kind of creature he actually is." "I believe that you saw him, because over the years I've heard whooping sounds coming from the pine needles, and I always knew in my heart that there was some kind of primate living out there. So it doesn't surprise me at all that you encountered such an intriguing, mystical creature. I'm surprised you weren't absolutely terrified." "I think I was too shocked to be afraid," I told her. "I couldn't believe what I was actually seeing, and he was so magnificent. I was more in awe of him than afraid. But if I'd been close up to him, I would have been absolutely terrified. I would have bolted away as fast as I could. I mean, he was very scary looking and very daunting and intimidating. Close up, anybody would do their nut." "What about Aunt Selena? Was she afraid?" asked my mother. "No, because she thought he was a god of some kind, so she was bowing down to the creature on the forest floor, and none of the women looked up, not even once. They were totally submissive. If they had, they would have screamed in terror. I am certain of that." "Well, that had to be a good thing," said my mother. "I do know that acting submissive with apes curtails any desire for them to become aggressive." "But, Mum, what about Aunt Selena?" I said. "She's a real live witch in charge of a coven. Are you not going to stop her from dabbling with something as evil and as heinous as witchcraft? Surely you must." "Darling, don't judge your aunt. She's only having a little fun. And don't condemn her for the choices she makes. Condemn not, lest you be condemned. We all play our part in the game of life, and judging by your Aunt Selena, it's not the worst thing that she could possibly do. Just let her be herself. I'm sure she'll find her way somewhere down the road." My mother was right. Selena went through many strange metamorphoses in her life. She went from being a witch to being a Buddhist, then she went travelling around the world, then she became a teacher, and then finally a missionary. So the game of life took her on a very exciting and interesting journey. It was only in 2006 that I was to discover that the creature I encountered all those years ago in the woods as a 14-year-old girl was in fact a Bigfoot, a Yeti, a Sasquatch or a hairy man. I found this out when my mother and I were watching a program on TV called Finding Bigfoot, and then I remember jumping up and down with absolute delight when I realised that this was indeed the creature that I'd seen in the Pine Needle Woods. I was amazed how I'd encountered the creature in such unusual circumstances when my aunt had fancied herself as the head of a witch's coven. I truly believe things could have panned out very differently if she and her friends had not been in such a submissive position in front of this great creature. I still cannot forget how completely joyous, whimsical and childlike the creature became when he was confronted by bowls of the most delectable fruits and nuts. I truly believe he thought he had died and gone to heaven 100 times over, and that Christmas had come early. I think he must have forgotten all those weird cloaked figures on their knees in the forest floor as he eagerly trotted away with all his mouth-watering treats. There you are. I warned you my story was super weird, but weird things often happen when you encounter the hairy man, and invariably it will only ever happen when you least expect it. So there you are. That's my story. I mean, isn't that absolutely true? What a fabulous story. I do want to say that I hear this over and over again, that it's usually the most bizarre circumstances that actually lead to a Bigfoot encounter. And people often, when they actually go looking for a Bigfoot, they never find one. It's almost like the Bigfoot knows what they're planning to do and doesn't reveal himself to them. It does seem to be that when people are on their own, or when they're least expecting it, or perhaps they're very joyous or very sad, that seems to be when Bigfoot will show his face. Until next time, goodbye and good night.